Let's do a quick recap of the energy notes that I published this week. I started out last weekend looking at Phillips 66, and specifically they reported their 2022 annual results. And the most interesting bit of that, to me at least, was the cash transfers back to shareholders. Phillips 66 reported record profit in 2022, and they delivered over $3 billion of that profit back to shareholders in the form of share repurchases and dividends. And that's interesting for a number of different reasons. A big one is that a lot of refiners these days are reporting record profits. And there's basically two things you can do with all those profits. One is use them, deploy them yourself, invest back into the business. The other is hand them over to shareholders. Now it gets interesting to think, okay, how do refiners reinvest in their own business when we know there's not a whole lot of appetite for refinery expansions in the United States? And the answer to that largely comes through low carbon fuels. There's renewable diesel, there's sustainable aviation fuel, a host of other opportunities where you can invest in converting existing refinery capacity into serving these lower carbon fuel markets. There's a lot of capital that's required to make that happen. Also, that is not a slam dunk investment. These are still very early days when it comes to low carbon fuels. We don't know exactly how the demand profile for those fuels will evolve. We don't know exactly what the optimal configuration looks like, particularly as you are reconfiguring a traditional petroleum refinery into a renewable fuels production facility. There's a lot of unknowns there. And so the safer bet, frankly, at least in the short term, is to just turn around and hand that cash back over to shareholders. And that's what Phillips 66 is doing. And they're doing it in a very visible way. 5 times through their prepared remarks on their earnings call, they emphasized the fact that they were handing these billions of dollars back to shareholders. So it's typically a good thing in the sense that shareholders appreciate having that cash returned to them. They can then go deploy that cash however they want. But it does introduce some vulnerability for the enterprise because those are dollars that are no longer available to try to manage a transition into a lower carbon environment. So it's interesting to see how Phillips 66 is charting its own path through that particular challenge. And then we can compare that to how other refiners are navigating the same sort of challenge. So it's an interesting space to keep our eyes on. So that was my post from last weekend. I then covered NextEra Energy, and that's a huge energy, power generation company here in the U.S., and it produces a lot of that energy from renewables. And I wrote 2 notes about NextEra because they just reported their 2022 annual results. The first one was a demonstration of how NextEra is investing heavily in both its wind power generation, but also in its battery storage. So with wind, it's just investing a large amount in aggregate dollars into that space. With battery storage, it's investing much more proportionally than, say, it is into solar. And that's pretty interesting for a number of different reasons, a big one being battery storage is an important part of the energy transition. It's an important part of ensuring the viability of renewable sources going forward. One big challenge around renewables is that you can generate the electricity when the wind and the sun are working in your favor, but that doesn't always align with when the energy is needed. And so you need to be able to separate when you generate that electricity from when you dispatch that electricity. And energy storage is an important part of that story. So the fact that NextEra is investing aggressively into battery storage is pretty interesting. It's in some indication they understand that's a part of the energy transition that is least understood, that is most urgent to resolve, and they're investing accordingly. I also wrote about NextEra's investment in its own capacity expansion and the fact that these charges that they're taking on their income statement that demonstrate how efficiently they're building out their portfolio indicate that NextEra is actually becoming more efficient with time. Used to, a couple of years ago, it would cost on the order of $60,000 per megawatt of capacity for them to build out this portfolio expansion, whereas today that number has dropped a little over $50,000 per megawatt. So that trend is important because in order to get renewable energy to be cost competitive with hydrocarbons, you need these capital costs to come down, and those manifest in the depreciation and amortization charges that I wrote about in that second NextEra post. And then on Thursday, I wrote about Vestas, and that is one of the world's largest, if not the largest, manufacturer of wind turbines. And they published their 2022 results recently, and we saw that they actually published a loss in 2022, and it was their worst operating margin since at least 2010, which is as far back as I happened to pull the data. We've seen a steady erosion in operating margin for Vestas since 2016. It's been an annual decline each of those years for the past 6 years. And the management team was pretty frank about assessing its performance in 2022. It acknowledged the importance of the company becoming profitable. That is the way that, in order to make the transition viable, the energy transition viable, Vestas has to become a profitable company again. And the company and the management team also talked about the importance of permitting processes. And what's interesting there is that renewable companies are starting to learn the reality that hydrocarbon companies have learned for a while, which is it is increasingly difficult to get new energy infrastructure permitted. It takes more time, it's more costly, there's more uncertainty in the process to really even understand whether you're going to actually earn the permit on the back end of all the effort that you put into applying for it. All of this cost, all of this delay, all of this uncertainty adds to the expense of energy infrastructure. And this has been going on for a while now, but what's the inflection point now is the fact that capital costs are increasing. Interest rates are going up. From 2010 through 2022, interest rates are pretty low, capital was freely available. So this added uncertainty from the regulatory apparatus wasn't hugely problematic because these projects could still be authorized. There was still confidence that you could make a return on those investments. But with interest rates up and capital not nearly as available today as it was 2 or 3 years ago, add on top of that the increasing uncertainty around energy regulation, and there are projects that would otherwise be viable that now are not viable. And what that means is that energy becomes more expensive and less accessible at a time where both of those things are more problematic than they have been in quite a while. So that is broadly a recap of my research through this week. As always, feel free to leave me a note, and if you have any suggestions for what you suggest that I write about next week. No guarantees that I end up following through on any of those suggestions, but I do always appreciate the ideas that you might have. Thanks a bunch for listening, and I'll keep in touch. We'll see you soon.